Hi, I'm Alex, and my presentation is about visualizing Indigenous land base in Prairie Canada, which is a big topic, but what I'd like to get across is that especially with Indigenous GIS and cartography, what's really important is having a good handle on the historical context of what you're dealing with. And all of you, let good practice, I think, is to let all of your design choices flow from there. So one of the big legal differences between Canada and the United States is that Canadian Indigenous law rests on a large number of unbroken historical treaties between the British Crown and its Indigenous subjects. Whether those treaties were fair and equitable is another question entirely. But the Canadian, but in the Canadian context, um, all of the boundaries currently in place on the Canadian provinces flow from these historical agreements that were made in the 19th century. So, as in the US, the goal of Canadian Indigenous policy was to take these nomadic hunter-gatherer societies and confine and coerce them into a settled agricultural European way of life. And here's our first difficulty doing GIS and cartography, because hunter-gatherer societies do not have clearly defined boundaries in the same way that agricultural ones do. And this is a contentious topic because a lot of modern Indigenous land claims are based on historical presence, which ranges much more widely than their current reserve land base does. So one thing I do to address this is when I list the name of a band government that governs a particular reserve or group of reserves, I always set that label away from the reserves just a little bit to indicate that that band has a wider historical presence in the region, but one that cannot be clearly defined through conventional cartographic means. And I leave it there because sometimes what's important is to simply indicate that an unknown thing is unknown. So then something else I put special attention into including in my work are surrendered reserves, because shady political and business interests have always sought to have Indigenous land rights curtailed for their own benefit. And I have put a lot of effort into tracking these down, because many of them are quite obscure. These are referenced mostly from original surveys, due to the lack of modern GIS work that has been done on many of these historical cases. So then, because a lot of these historical surrenders were illegal even at the time, they were they were breaking the boundaries of early 20th century law. In the 1990s, a lot of Saskatchewan First Nations were able to sue for something called Treaty Land Entitlement, or TLE. They were able to get back their surrendered land base by purchasing new parcels on the open market from farmers who are willing to sell. And that created some really spectacular and unusual boundaries, which you can see on these little excerpts of the map here. And this is also a common issue with the United States, where a lot of reserves and trust lands have similarly exotic looking outlines. So my only advice for visualizing these is use a lot of line knockouts under text. Um, that's what's making the labels legible here, is that all the text on this map is interrupting the lines underneath it. So again, none of those design solutions I just mentioned are really radical or innovative. The biggest obstacle to this work is actually that a lot of the government shapefiles I consulted were completely untrustworthy. They were incomplete, or some of them were straight up wrong. So seek to understand the historical context, have a bit of healthy skepticism about who is benefiting from the current availability of data, and I think you'll be well prepared to address these topics in your work.